June 5, 1944, 24 hours before the largest amphibious invasion in human history, a German reconnaissance pilot soared over the fields of southeastern England. Through his camera lens, he captured what appeared to be an apocalyptic nightmare for the Third Reich. Hundreds of Allied bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft lined up on airfields, massive fuel depots, countless barracks, an invasion force so enormous it would surely crush any defense. He raced back to his base, convinced he had discovered where the Allies would strike. But there was one problem. Almost everything he photographed was fake. This is the story of how a brilliant deception, involving wooden aircraft, inflatable tanks, and phantom armies fooled Adolf Hitler himself and changed the course of World War II forever. It's a tale of creativity, courage, and the largest con job pulled on a military superpower. And at the center of it all was one of the most audacious uses of fake aircraft the world has ever seen. By early 1944, everyone knew the Allies were coming. The question wasn't if, but where and when. Hitler was obsessed with this question. He had fortified the entire Atlantic coast with the Atlantic Wall, a series of bunkers, mines, and obstacles stretching from Norway to Spain. But he couldn't defend everything equally. He needed to know where to concentrate his forces. The fate of Nazi Germany depended on getting this answer right. The Allies knew this too, and they had a secret weapon that had nothing to do with superior firepower or brave soldiers. It was deception. Pure, calculated, industrial-scale deception. The plan was called Operation Fortitude, and it was designed to make Hitler believe the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, about 150 miles northeast of the actual target, Normandy. To pull this off, the Allies needed to create an entire fake army, not just a small unit or a misleading radio transmission, an entire army group, complete with tanks, trucks, landing craft, and most importantly for our story, an air force. They called it the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG, and put General George Patton in command. On paper, FUSAG was the most powerful Allied force in Britain, with over 1 million men. In reality, it barely existed. The mastermind behind much of this illusion was a British officer, Colonel John Turner, working with a joint British-American team that included some of the most creative minds pulled from the film industry, theatre, and art world. These weren't typical military men. They were set designers, painters, sound engineers, and special effects artists. Their mission was to build an army out of thin air, and they had to make it convincing enough to fool the most paranoid military intelligence apparatus in the world. The deception operation had multiple layers. There were double agents feeding false information to German intelligence. There were fake radio transmissions mimicking the chatter of a massive military force. There were real commanders, like Patton, making public appearances in southeastern England. But the most visible part of the deception, the part that German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph and analyze, was the physical dummy equipment. And nothing was more important than aircraft. Aircraft were crucial to the deception for several reasons. First, any invasion force needed air superiority, so a massive concentration of planes near the supposed invasion point made strategic sense. Second, aircraft were highly visible from the air, exactly what German reconnaissance needed to see. Third, building fake aircraft was easier and cheaper than building fake ships or tanks of comparable convincing quality. And fourth, the sheer number of aircraft required made it impossible to use real planes. They were all needed elsewhere for actual combat operations. The man who became legendary for creating these phantom aircraft was a British flight sergeant named Tony Oyetung, working with a specialized unit that included carpenters, painters, and riggers. Oyetung had worked in aircraft construction before the war and understood both how planes were built and how they appeared from above. This knowledge would prove invaluable. The dummy aircraft program began in earnest in late 1943. The team studied German reconnaissance patterns, analyzing what altitude they typically flew at, what time of day they came, and most importantly, what details they could actually photograph. The answer was surprisingly forgiving. From 20,000 feet, the typical altitude for reconnaissance flights, fine details disappeared. What mattered was shape, shadow, and scale. If something looked like a bomber from 4 miles up, it was a bomber as far as German photo analysts were concerned. The first prototypes were crude, simple wooden frames covered with painted canvas, but they were quickly refined. The team developed a standardized construction method that allowed for rapid production. The frames were made from lightweight timber, often pine or spruce. The surfaces were stretched canvas, or sometimes even treated paper, painted in appropriate camouflage patterns. The key was creating the right silhouettes and shadows. One of the cleverest aspects was how they handled shadows. A real aircraft sitting on an airfield cast specific shadows depending on the time of day and sun angle. The dummy aircraft were designed with this in mind. Some even had painted shadows on the canvas itself, reinforced by the natural shadows cast by the wooden frame. From above, especially in black and white photography, the effect was remarkably convincing. The construction crews became incredibly efficient. A team of 6 men could build a full-size bomber replica in less than 8 hours. They worked in warehouses and workshops across southeastern England, churning out aircraft at a pace that would have made actual aircraft factories envious. But these planes cost a fraction of real aircraft, about £50 each, compared to tens of thousands for an actual bomber. The dummy aircraft came in all varieties. There were replicas of B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, C-47 transport planes, Spitfires, and even gliders. Each type required different construction techniques. Fighters were smaller, but needed more refined shapes to be convincing. Bombers were enormous, but their size made rough construction more forgivable, since finer details couldn't be seen from reconnaissance altitude anyway. But building the aircraft was only half the challenge. They had to be deployed in ways that looked authentic. Real airfields have specific layouts. Aircraft are parked in dispersal areas, not random clusters. There are fuel trucks, maintenance vehicles, crew quarters. The deception had to include all of this. So alongside the dummy aircraft, crews built fake fuel storage tanks from canvas and scaffolding, fake vehicles from wood and paint, even fake anti-aircraft positions to suggest these valuable assets were being protected. Make sure to subscribe to our channel if you're enjoying this incredible story of wartime deception. We dive deep into the untold stories of World War II, and there's so much more to discover. The airfields themselves were often real, but inactive or under construction. This added authenticity. German intelligence knew these airfields existed, so seeing them suddenly filled with aircraft made strategic sense. Some of the dummy installations were built on actual grass fields that had been prepared to look like airfields from above, complete with fake runways painted onto the grass or created with dark-colored materials that showed up clearly in aerial photographs. One of the most sophisticated aspects was creating the illusion of activity. A static display of aircraft would raise suspicions. Real airfields are constantly busy with planes taking off, landing, being moved around for maintenance. The deception teams couldn't make their wooden planes fly, but they could simulate activity in other ways. They would periodically rearrange the dummy aircraft to different positions on the airfield. German reconnaissance flights didn't come every day, so when they did return and photograph the same airfield, the aircraft would be in different spots, suggesting they'd been moved for operations or maintenance. Some dummy aircraft were even built on wheeled platforms, so they could be easily repositioned. They also created dummy aircraft in various states of assembly or maintenance. Some would have engine cowlings removed, shown by painting dark openings where engines would be. Others would be surrounded by maintenance equipment or partially covered with tarps. This attention to detail made the installations look lived in and operational rather than staged. The crews even dealt with the problem of tracks and wear patterns. Real airfields show evidence of use: tire tracks, worn grass, muddy areas near hangars. The deception teams would deliberately create these wear patterns around their dummy installations, sometimes driving vehicles around to create realistic track marks, other times using rakes and other tools to simulate the erosion patterns of a busy military base, where the damage was another concern. The dummy aircraft needed to withstand British weather well enough to remain convincing, but not so well that they became expensive to maintain. The canvas and wood construction was actually ideal for this. It was sturdy enough to last through rain and wind for months, but cheap enough that damaged units could simply be replaced rather than repaired. Some dummy aircraft that were torn up by storms were deliberately left in damaged states, as this actually added to the realism. Real military installations aren't always perfectly maintained either. The scale of the operation was staggering. By May 1944, just before D-Day, there were estimated to be over 500 dummy aircraft spread across airfields in southeastern England. Combined with inflatable tanks, fake landing craft, dummy artillery pieces, and false supply depots, the entire FUSAG deception involved thousands of fake military assets. The dummy equipment outnumbered real equipment in the region by a significant margin. But did it work? The Germans were certainly watching. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights regularly penetrated British airspace, often at high altitude, where RAF interceptors had difficulty catching them. These flights brought back thousands of photographs that were meticulously analyzed by German intelligence officers, and they were seeing exactly what the Allies wanted them to see. German intelligence reports from early 1944 show they were tracking the buildup of Allied forces in southeastern England with great concern. They noted the concentration of aircraft, the construction of new airfield facilities, and the apparent positioning of major combat units under Patton's command. The deception was working at the photographic level, but photography alone wasn't enough. The Germans needed to believe in the larger strategic picture. This is where the other elements of Operation Fortitude became crucial. The fake radio traffic mimicked the communications patterns of a massive army group preparing for invasion. Double agents, German spies who had been captured and turned by British intelligence, sent reports back to their German handlers describing the build-up they were observing in southeastern England. Some of these double agents were so trusted by German intelligence that their reports carried enormous weight. One of the most important double agents was a Spaniard codenamed Garbo by the British. Garbo had created an entire fictional spy network supposedly spread across Britain. His reports to the Germans included detailed descriptions of military units, equipment concentrations, and troop movements, most of which were completely fabricated. But they aligned perfectly with what German reconnaissance was photographing, including the dummy aircraft installations. This correlation between human intelligence and photographic evidence made the deception incredibly convincing. The Germans also used something called order of battle analysis. This involved tracking individual military units, their insignia, their commanders, and their locations to build a comprehensive picture of enemy forces. The Allies fed false information into this system through multiple channels. Real military units were given fake radio call signs, suggesting they were part of FUSAG. Shoulder patches and unit insignia were manufactured for non-existent divisions. Officers were sent to southeastern England to be spotted by German agents. All of these deception elements worked together synergistically. The dummy aircraft weren't meant to fool the Germans on their own. They were one piece of a massive puzzle that, when assembled, showed Hitler exactly what the Allies wanted him to see: a million-man army group in southeastern England preparing to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler bought it completely. Despite the fact that some of his generals, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, suspected Normandy might be the target, Hitler remained convinced that Pas-de-Calais was the main objective. He kept some of his best divisions, including panzer units that could have been decisive in Normandy, held back near Pas-de-Calais waiting for the real invasion that would never come. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the deception didn't end. In fact, it intensified. The Allies wanted Hitler to believe that Normandy was a feint, a diversion to draw German forces away from where the main invasion would come. 4 weeks after D-Day, the dummy aircraft installations in southeastern England remained in place. Fake radio traffic continued. Double agents sent urgent messages about Fusag preparing for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. The result was catastrophic for Germany. Hitler held back crucial armored divisions for weeks, waiting for an invasion that existed only in the imagination of Allied deception planners and the wooden aircraft sitting on fake airfields. By the time he realized the truth, the Allies had established an unbreakable foothold in Normandy. The outcome of the war in Western Europe was effectively decided. After the war, when the full scale of Operation Fortitude was revealed, German intelligence officers were stunned. They had been completely fooled. Their reconnaissance photographs, their spy reports, their radio intercepts all had pointed to the same conclusion, and that conclusion had been wrong. One German general reportedly said that Operation Fortitude was worth at least 10 divisions to the Allies, meaning it had the same impact as adding 10 full divisions to the invasion force without firing a single shot. The wooden aircraft played a starring role in this deception. Those canvas and timber replicas, built by carpenters and artists in British workshops, had helped convince Hitler that the invasion would come at the wrong place. They had bought the Allies precious time and saved countless lives. In the strange calculus of war, these fake planes were as valuable as real bombers, not because they could drop bombs, but because they could plant ideas in the enemy's mind. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because we're bringing you more fascinating World War II stories like this one every week. There's so much history that deserves to be told. The story of the dummy aircraft doesn't end at D-Day. The techniques developed for Operation Fortitude were used throughout the rest of the war. As Allied forces advanced across Europe, deception units continued to deploy dummy equipment to mislead German forces about where attacks would come from and in what strength. The dummy aircraft technique was even shared with Soviet forces, who used similar methods on the Eastern Front. In the Pacific Theater, American forces used dummy aircraft to protect real air bases. By creating fake airfields with dummy planes nearby, they could draw Japanese bombing raids away from actual operational bases. Some of these dummy installations were attacked multiple times, with Japanese pilots reporting successful strikes on American air power, not realizing they were bombing plywood and canvas. The legacy of these deception operations influenced military doctrine for decades. The realization that an enemy's perceptions could be manipulated on such a grand scale led to the development of entire military branches dedicated to deception and psychological operations. Modern military forces still use decoys and deception, though with more sophisticated technology. Inflatable tanks have been replaced by radar reflectors and electronic warfare systems. But the basic principle remains the same. Make the enemy see what you want them to see. The individuals involved in Operation Fortitude rarely received public recognition during their lifetimes. The operation remained classified for decades after the war. Men like Tony Airtung, who built the dummy aircraft, returned to civilian life without fanfare. The artists, carpenters, and engineers who had waged war with canvas and paint instead of bullets and bombs were largely forgotten by history, but their contribution was immense. Consider the mathematics of it. A real B-17 bomber in 1944 cost about $240,000 to build and required thousands of man-hours of skilled labor. A dummy B-17 cost about £50 and could be built in a day. Yet in the context of Operation Fortitude, that dummy B-17 was potentially more valuable than a real one. It wasn't going to bomb Berlin, but it was going to help ensure that when real bombers and real soldiers went into action, they would face a confused and mispositioned enemy. The dummy aircraft program also reveals something profound about the nature of warfare. We often think of military power in terms of weapons, soldiers, and technology, but information and perception are just as important. An army that doesn't know where its enemy is or believes its enemy is somewhere they're not, is already half defeated before the first shot is fired. The dummy aircraft were weapons of information warfare, tools designed not to destroy but to deceive. There were close calls. On several occasions, German reconnaissance aircraft flew lower than expected, or took photographs in particularly good lighting conditions that revealed details the deception teams hadn't anticipated. Some photographs showed shadows that didn't quite match up, or construction details that looked suspicious, but German photo analysts, dealing with thousands of images and under pressure to provide quick assessments, generally miss these tells. The human mind tends to see what it expects to see, and German intelligence expected to see a massive Allied build-up in southeastern England because all their other intelligence sources were telling them the same thing. There was also the constant whirring of German commandos or agents getting close enough to physically examine the dummy installations. If a German agent had been able to walk up to one of the dummy aircraft and touch it, the deception would have been exposed immediately. But British security was tight. The areas with dummy installations were heavily patrolled, and known German agents were either captured or, if they'd been turned into double agents, carefully directed away from seeing anything that might reveal the truth, whether was both friend and enemy to the deception. On one hand, the frequently overcast British weather made it harder for German reconnaissance to get clear photographs. On the other hand, storms could damage the dummy installations, requiring constant maintenance and replacement. The crews became expert at rapid repairs, sometimes having to completely rebuild damaged dummy aircraft overnight before the next German reconnaissance flight. One fascinating aspect that has only come to light in recent decades through declassified documents is just how close the Germans came to figuring it out on several occasions. There were intelligence officers in the German High Command who were skeptical of the Fusag build-up. They noted discrepancies in the intelligence reports and questioned why such a large force would be positioned so obviously. But these skeptics were overruled by higher-ranking officers who trusted their intelligence sources, and ultimately by Hitler himself, who had his own strategic theories about where the Allies would invade. Hitler's personality and leadership style actually made the deception easier to pull off. He tended to make strategic decisions based on his intuition, and then seek out intelligence that confirmed his preconceptions. Once he had decided that Pas-de-Calais was the invasion target, he interpreted all intelligence through that lens. The dummy aircraft and other deception efforts fed into confirmation bias at the highest level of German command. The technical sophistication of the dummy aircraft evolved throughout the operation. Early versions were quite crude by the standards of what came later. As the teams gained experience and received feedback about what German reconnaissance was and wasn't seeing, they refined their techniques. Later dummy aircraft had more realistic details, better paint schemes, and clever additions like fake oil stains on the ground beneath engines to simulate maintenance activities. Some dummy aircraft were even equipped with heating elements that would warm them slightly, making them show up differently on infrared photography. If the Germans were using that technology, this level of detail shows how seriously the Allies took the deception and how much thought went into every aspect of making it convincing. The psychological impact on the construction crews is worth considering too. These men were building fake aircraft while real aircraft were fighting and dying in combat operations every day. Some of them had friends or family members in actual bomber crews. It could have felt like meaningless work, building props for an elaborate stage play, while real war was happening elsewhere. But they were told, in as much detail as security allowed, that their work was crucial to the invasion's success, and they took pride in their craftsmanship, competing to see who could build the most convincing dummy aircraft in the shortest time. After the war, some of the dummy aircraft were kept as training aids for intelligence analysts, teaching them what to look for when analyzing aerial photographs. Others were simply burned or scrapped. A very few ended up in museums, where they remain today as physical artifacts of one of the most successful deception operations in military history. To see one in person is a strange experience. They look obviously fake up close, crude even. But you have to remember, they were never meant to be seen up close. They were meant to be photographed from 4 miles up by a stressed reconnaissance pilot racing to avoid interceptors, then analyzed by an intelligence officer looking at grainy black and white photos under deadline pressure. The full story of the dummy aircraft program and Operation Fortitude wasn't revealed until decades after the war. Some participants didn't know the full scope of what they'd been part of until they read about it in books published in the 1970s and 1980s. The secrecy was maintained so thoroughly that even after the war, people who had built dummy aircraft in one location didn't know there were other teams doing the same thing elsewhere. This secrecy extended to the post-war period for good reason. The techniques and principles of Operation Fortitude were considered valuable military secrets that might be used again, and indeed they were, in various forms, in subsequent conflicts. The dummy aircraft technique specifically was used in Korea and Vietnam, unlikely in other conflicts where such operations remain classified to this day. Modern military deception has become far more sophisticated, involving electronic warfare, cyber operations, and advanced decoy technology, but the basic principles established by the wooden aircraft of Operation Fortitude remain valid. Create something that looks real to the enemy's sensors, place it in a context that makes strategic sense, support it with corroborating intelligence from multiple sources, and exploit the enemy's existing beliefs and expectations. In many ways, Operation Fortitude and its dummy aircraft represent the perfect military operation. 0 casualties were inflicted by these fake planes, yet they helped achieve strategic objectives that would have otherwise required massive combat operations and tremendous loss of life. They were cheap to produce, easy to deploy, and incredibly effective. They couldn't win the war on their own, but they created conditions that made winning possible. The human element of this story is what makes it truly compelling. These weren't scientists in labs or generals in headquarters, though they played their roles. These were carpenters, painters, set designers, and artists who found themselves fighting a war with their peacetime skills. A man who had built theatrical sets in London was now building fake bombers to fool Hitler. An artist who had painted landscapes was now carefully matching Luftwaffe camouflage patterns on canvas stretched over pine frames. These unlikely warriors never fired a shot, but they were as crucial to victory as the soldiers storming Omaha Beach. There's also something almost whimsical about the whole operation, a quality that makes it easy to underestimate its seriousness and effectiveness. Wooden aircraft fooling one of history's most powerful military forces sounds like something from a comedy film, not a real military operation. But that whimsy shouldn't obscure the sophistication of the planning, the skill of the execution, and the courage of everyone involved. If the deception had been discovered, it could have given the Germans crucial intelligence about where the real invasion was coming. The timing had to be perfect too. Deploy the dummy installations too early, and the Germans might have time to investigate more thoroughly and discover the truth. Deploy them too late, and they wouldn't be convincing as part of a pre-invasion build-up. The deception planners had to work backward from D-Day, calculating how long it would realistically take to assemble an invasion force, and then make sure their dummy build-up matched that timeline. Some of the most interesting details come from interviews with German intelligence officers after the war. They describe the process of analyzing reconnaissance photographs and how they assessed what they were seeing. They were looking for certain tells that would indicate dummy equipment, unnatural symmetry, lack of variation, absence of supporting details. The Operation Fortitude teams had studied these same tells and specifically designed their installations to avoid them. It was a game of move and countermove, played out in workshops and photo labs rather than on battlefields. The story also highlights the importance of integrated operations. The dummy aircraft alone might have raised suspicions, but when combined with fake radio traffic, double agent reports, fake supply depots, inflatable tanks, and all the other elements of the deception. They became one brushstroke in a larger painting. Each element supported and reinforced the others, creating a complete picture that was greater than the sum of its parts. There's a final irony to the story. After D-Day, when some German officers began to suspect they'd been deceived, they looked back at the intelligence and reconnaissance photographs, and even knowing that much of it had been fake, they had difficulty determining what was real and what wasn't. The deception had been that thorough. Some of the installations they'd worried about and photographed obsessively had been completely fake. Others had been real, but misidentified in terms of their purpose or strength. And some real installations had been ignored, because they seemed less threatening than the fake ones. This created a crisis of confidence in German intelligence that lasted for the rest of the war. If they could be fooled so completely about something as massive as Fusag, what else might they be wrong about? This uncertainty paralyzed decision-making at crucial moments. Even after the truth about Normandy became obvious, Hitler kept divisions near Pas-de-Calais for weeks, still half believing that the real invasion might yet come. The dummy aircraft had planted seeds of doubt that continued to bear fruit long after they'd served their primary purpose. The technical challenges of building convincing dummy aircraft are worth examining in more detail. It wasn't just about creating the right shape. The materials had to be weatherproof enough to last, but cheap enough to be expendable. They had to be light enough to move easily, but sturdy enough to withstand brushish weather. The camouflage patterns had to match real aircraft and had to be applied in ways that would photograph correctly from altitude. Paint was a particular challenge. Real aircraft were painted with specialized camouflage paints that had specific reflective properties. The dummy aircraft used whatever paint was available, which didn't always match perfectly, but the teams learned to compensate for this by adjusting their painting techniques, sometimes deliberately weathering the paint to change its reflective properties, other times applying multiple coats in specific patterns that approximated the look of real aircraft paint in photographs. The construction of larger bombers required particular ingenuity. A B-17 Flying Fortress is a large aircraft, over 74 feet long with a wingspan of 103 feet. Creating a convincing replica at that scale with lightweight materials was a genuine engineering challenge. The solution was a combination of full-scale frameworks for the main fuselage and wings, with details painted on rather than built three-dimensionally. Engine nutshells were simplified wooden boxes painted to look like radial engines. Gun turrets were suggested rather than fully modeled. From 20,000 feet, it all looked convincing. As we reach the end of this incredible story, it's worth reflecting on what the wooden aircraft of Operation Fortitude teach us about warfare, deception, and human ingenuity. They remind us that wars are won not just by superior firepower, but by superior thinking, that creativity and intelligence can be as valuable as courage and strength, and that sometimes the best weapon is the one that never fires a shot but instead changes what the enemy believes. The wooden aircraft that fooled Hitler represent one of the finest moments of Allied planning and execution in World War II. They were a perfect marriage of art and warfare, of creativity and strategy, and they played a crucial role in the liberation of Europe, doing their part without ever leaving the ground. In the vast and terrible story of World War II, filled with tragedy and heroism on an incomprehensible scale, the tale of wooden aircraft and the people who built them stands out as a reminder that intelligence, creativity, and deception can change the course of history just as surely as tanks and bombs. The pilot who photographed those wooden aircraft on June 5, 1944, had no idea he was looking at one of the greatest military deceptions ever conceived, and that ignorance, that carefully crafted illusion, helped save thousands of lives and win a war.